Sit in the back, you are not important." My sister hissed loud enough for the whole room to hear, and for a second I thought the floor under the banquet table might open up. I had ridden an aircraft with alarms screaming over black water at 2 in the morning, but nothing made my stomach drop like those 8 words at my own mother's birthday party. I had pictured sliding into the row beside her, kissing her cheek. Instead, Brianna blocked the aisle in her perfect dress and makeup, a wine glass in her hand, as if she owned the room. "This section is for people who are actually here for Mom," she added softer now with that little smile she used when she wanted to hurt me and still look polite. Someone at the next table laughed. Heat rose in my face as she tipped her glass toward the back of the hall. "There are empty seats by the buffet. You can sit there." I heard a chair scrape as an usher dragged one of the spare chairs toward the far corner. As I walked down the aisle alone, I could feel eyes on my back, hear the low whispers that sound polite and cut underneath. "Isn't she the one who just runs around in uniform?" a cousin murmured. "Well, Brianna is the one really taking care of their mother," someone else replied, and the words landed heavier than the carry-on in my hand. I sat so far from the front that the microphone on the stage sounded thin. When I looked up, I saw the big screens begin a slideshow. Photo after photo of Brianna covered the wall. Brianna at kindergarten, Brianna at graduation, Brianna at her wedding, Brianna cutting a ribbon at her office, rows of awards and staged smiles. Not one picture of me in uniform, no shot of the day I raised my right hand, no grainy photo of my team after a long night on cold water. It was as if I had been erased from our family story. I had chosen deployments and missed holidays, a path my family did not understand, but as another photo of Brianna and my mom arm in arm at this same country club flashed on the screen, my chest tightened. This was not just distance. This was erasing. This was family betrayal dressed up as celebration. For a heartbeat, the music and clinking glasses faded, and another room came back to me. A bare briefing room on base harsh bulbs, buzzing sand on the floor, a flag officer reading my name, while a line of exhausted operators stood behind me. The metal of the silver star had been cold against my uniform that day, heavy and real. Yet here, in this polished hall in San Antonio, I was back to being the wild second daughter who never showed up. My phone buzzed in the slim pocket of my dress. I pulled it out under the table, and the bright screen lit my face. A message from Chief Miller sat at the top. "Falcon 3. We are wheels down nearby by 1900. You still want us to swing by?" My heart thumped once hard. I looked up at the head table. Brianna leaned in close to Mom, laughing, one manicured hand resting on Mom's arm as if she were the only child in the room. Hank sat on the other side, nodding and smiling. No one here knew that the person shoved into the corner had signed half the papers that kept their pretty life standing. No one here cared that while they had dinners and pictures, I had spent nights counting breaths in the dark next to men who might not see the morning if I chose wrong. In their story, I was still the kid Hank once joked the military would fix. I looked at my mother laughing under a banner that said, "Happy 70th Marianne," and felt something turn over inside my chest. They had written me as the failure in uniform, the background daughter, the one who did not show up. I slid my phone back into my pocket and sat up straighter. They only see a failure in a uniform, I thought. Tonight, they are going to meet the reason their failure is still alive. I straightened my back in the plastic folding chair that did not match any of the others and fixed my eyes on the head table. Whatever they thought I was, whatever role this toxic family had given me, I knew who I was when I stepped outside these walls. I was Falcon 3, and my brothers in arms were already on their way. I grew up in the outer edges of San Antonio, where the houses looked tired before their time, and the air always tasted faintly of dust and hot asphalt. And when I think back to those years, I can still hear the sound of my father, Daniel Locke, dropping his toolbox on the kitchen floor as he came home from whatever shift he was still holding, onto the metal clatter, sharp enough to make my mother flinch even before his drinking fully took control. and I remember the way his voice could swing from weary to furious, in a breath the way he praised my older sister Brianna with glowing pride, while letting his eyes slide past me as if I were part of the clutter. He did not have time to deal with calling her his smart girl while muttering that I was wild and asking why I could not just sit still like a normal daughter. As children, Brianna and I lived in the same small house, but not in the same world, hers filled with after-school tutoring and new notebooks and compliments from teachers who called her bright, while mine was made of scraped knees, an afternoon spent running through the neighborhood because motion felt safer than the rooms inside our house, where Daniel's temper could spark without warning, where he would slam cabinet doors or pound on the table, or in the worst moments, slap my mother across the cheek, while Brianna covered her ears upstairs, and I stood frozen, too young to understand, but old enough to know that staying small and quiet did not actually protect anyone. Money was always short bills stacked on the counter like silent accusations, and our part of San Antonio was the kind of place where most kids grew up knowing more about stress than summer vacations. And even then, Brianna shone like something polished teachers sending home certificates and invitations, while I brought home grass stains and stories about trying to race the boys at recess stories. My father said were proof I was becoming a tomboy, a troublemaker, someone he had no idea what to do with. But I found something else in those years, something that anchored me. When the yelling got too loud, because at the public library I would sit cross-legged on the cold floor and watch grainy documentaries about Navy ships cutting through the ocean, about Marines training on beaches, about people who seemed carved from focus and grit, and something in me whispered that maybe there was a world where strength mattered more than being the favorite child, a world where I could breathe without tiptoeing around someone else's anger. Then came the year everything cracked wide open. In 2010, my father was fired from his job after too many late arrivals and too many bottles hidden in the car. And for a while, he tried to hold on, tried to fix fans in neighbors' houses for cash, tried to pretend nothing was wrong, but the yelling grew louder, the nights longer, until one morning we woke to find his clothes gone and his boots missing from the doorway, and my mother Marianne stood in the kitchen wiping her face, trying not to let us see she was shaking. For a while, it was just the three of us in that cramped house, where the silence became its own kind of noise, until she met Hank, the owner of a small bar off Highway 90, a man who smiled easily in public and carried a sharper edge at home, someone who liked to speak softly in church and loudly in private when he wanted control of the budget or an explanation for who used too much water in the shower. Hank never yelled at Brianna, though. He praised her like my father once did, talking about her future, imagining her at college, telling neighbors she would go far, and whenever I walked into the room, he would pause and then chuckle, as if there were a joke. Only he understood, saying that maybe the military would be good for me someday. Maybe a uniform job would straighten me out. Maybe it was best to accept that not all children were meant for academic glory. By then, Brianna was 5 years ahead of me in everything in school, in looks, in the way adults treated her as if she were spun from light, while I was bundled in the shadows left behind. And I tried not to be angry because in a toxic family, resentment grows like a weed, even when you do not want it. But I could feel that weed tightening in my chest every time my mother handed Brianna money for college applications, while telling me we just needed to be practical about my options. Still, I kept moving. Running track after school, joining the swim team, feeling at home in the burn of muscles and cold water. And when a recruiter visited during junior year and talked about the Navy, about challenge and discipline and earning a place by grit, alone, I listened in a way I had never listened to any adult before. Because for the first time, someone was describing a life where being strong and stubborn and fast was not a flaw, but a foundation. I signed up for JROTC to test myself waking before dawn to run laps around the field, learning drill, studying naval history. And every time Brianna came home with college brochures and smug smiles, Hank would clap her on the shoulder while giving me a look that said he had already figured me out, already relegated me to some lower rung where expectations were minimal and value measured only in how useful my benefits might be someday. When I announced the week before graduation that I had sworn into the Navy Delayed Entry Program and would leave right after the summer, the dining room went silent, the kind of silence that tells you more than words, and Brianna gave that tight little smile and murmured that it was good I found something to do, then added, with a soft sting, that I should try not to come back broken. Hank laughed into his drink and said at least the military would give me free medical, so I would cost the family less someday, and my mother cried and told me she was proud, but her hands trembled as she said it, as if she did not know how to hold pride and fear at the same time. The day I shipped out from the military entrance processing station, the sun was harsh on the concrete, and my bag felt heavier than it should have, and as I hugged my mother, she whispered that she hoped I would find what I was looking for, though I was not sure she knew what that was. Brianna stood a few feet back, scrolling through her phone, glancing up only long enough to say good luck, like she was sending me to a summer internship instead of the life I had chosen to save myself. And Hank made a joke about writing if I needed money, knowing perfectly well that was never going to happen. As I boarded the bus, I understood with a clarity that settled like steel in my spine that in this family I had never been the bright one, or the chosen one, or the one they bragged about. I had been the spare, the backup plan, the child they assumed would end up in some uniform job that gave them talking points and benefits, and maybe that was the seed I needed because choosing the Navy was not an escape from responsibility. It was the only path that felt like mine, the only place where I could build a life not defined by their low expectations. And as the bus pulled away, I promised myself that whatever happened next, I would never again allow myself to be treated like the discount version of someone else. When I left San Antonio behind and stepped into the Navy pipeline in early 2016, I carried with me the memory of every look that said I would not make it, every dismissive comment that painted me as the child who would settle for a uniform because she could not do anything better. And those memories stayed with me through boot camp, where the smell of metal racks and disinfectant mixed with early morning sweat through the long days of drills, where instructors barked orders until my voice felt scraped raw and through the first whispers about a new program that would open a path for a select handful of women to attempt advanced special operations, training a program few believed would actually produce graduates, but one I felt in my bones I had to try for, even if no one in my family would ever understand why. By late 2017, I was deep in the selection gauntlet, miles of running on soft sand that swallowed my ankles, freezing surf plunges that stole the breath straight from my lungs, obstacle courses that tore at my palms until the skin cracked, and instructors who made quitting sound merciful as they shouted that we could ring the bell and walk away any time. A bell that gleamed under the floodlights like a promise of relief, and night after night, I looked at it and thought about Brianna smirking over her college brochures, while Hank told neighbors that some kids are just made for uniform jobs, and each time the memory made something spark in me, something that pushed my feet forward even when my legs shook so violently I had to grit my teeth to hide it. Hell Week was the moment I truly understood what breaking and rebuilding felt like 5 days, where sleep came in seconds stolen between evolutions, where the cold became a living thing that wrapped around your bones, where men twice my size leaned on my shoulder to stay upright, and I leaned right back, because in that dark tide of exhaustion, we were all just trying to keep each other alive. And sometime around the third night when the world blurred at the edges, I heard an instructor shout that anyone who wanted warmth or comfort could step forward and ring the bell, and I felt my body sway toward it before a sharp memory hit me like a slap. Brianna's voice telling me not to come back broken. Hank laughing that at least I would get free medical, and the humiliation burned hot enough to keep me standing in the surf until the sun rose and the instructors called us out. Weeks later, during a navigation drill well past midnight, our team became turned around in a maze of ravines near the training grounds. The moon barely bright enough to outline the ridges, radios sputtering with static and panic, creeping into the younger guys' movements as they argued about direction. But I tilted my head back, traced the faint arc of stars through a break in the cloud cover, and matched it to the last known point on our map, then pointed toward a narrow passage that looked wrong but felt right, telling them to trust me and move. And when we finally emerged onto the right clearing, Chief Miller stopped, stared at me, then let out a low whistle as he said, "I saw like a falcon up there." And from that moment, everyone around me used the name Falcon 3 without hesitation. It surprised me how natural leadership felt, not because I thought I deserved it, but because out there, respect had nothing to do with being the favorite child, or the quiet one, or the one with the polished achievements. It was built from decisions made under pressure and from keeping calm when everything inside you wanted to shake. And by 23, I had become the youngest team leader in a small task unit that rotated between Coronado, the Horn of Africa, and pockets of the Middle East, where hostage rescue and reconnaissance missions blurred into a rhythm of briefings, night movements, and long, silent watches under foreign stars. In the team room, young operators called me Ma'am or Captain Locke or simply Falcon 3, depending on the moment. And I never had to explain myself because what mattered to them was that I could lead them in and bring them out, nothing more, nothing less. Yet every call home during those years reminded me that my family lived in a different universe, one where Brianna talked at length about her promotions and work events, while barely pausing to ask where I was asking, instead if my salary was good or if the benefits were stable. And when I said I could not discuss operations, she took that as proof that I had nothing important to share, brushing it off with a short laugh while shifting the conversation back to herself. Hank entered the calls only long enough to drop hints about refinancing the bar and asking if my VA loan could help him secure a better rate, speaking as though my service existed mainly to be converted into convenience for him. And when I told him that was not how the loan worked, he muttered that it was a shame to waste good opportunities on someone who barely visited. My mother tried sometimes to sound proud, her voice soft and confused, as she said she hoped I was eating enough, but she never asked for details either. Never tried to understand why my voice was tired or why I spoke from airport terminals at odd hours. And more than once, Brianna cut in to ask if I would be home for a holiday, only to follow up with a remark about how my constant absence made it hard to plan family things, as though deployments were vacations I scheduled badly. I realized over time that they did not see the intensity of my days, the weight of decisions made in the dark, the quiet fear that settled in your ribs before a nighttime breach. They saw only the title Navy and filled in the rest with their own assumptions, believing I must be doing something generic, because if it were impressive or important, it would have been on the news, and since it was not on the news, it must mean nothing. Whenever I returned home for short leave, the contrast hit even harder because I would shift from being Falcon 3 on Friday to being just the other daughter by Sunday, and they would talk around me as if nothing I had survived had changed me, as if leadership and responsibility vanished the minute I stepped across their threshold. I did not resent them for not knowing the details, since most of what I did was quiet and unseen by design, but I did resent the way they never cared enough to ask the way they assumed Brianna carried the family because she stayed in town while I was gone, the way they dismissed my world as if it belonged to a child with a busy hobby instead of a woman who held other people's lives in her hands. And by the time I hit my final deployment before the night of the birthday party, I had already grown used to living in this split existence, where in one place, younger operators followed me with absolute trust, and in the other place, I was the daughter who never showed up, the one they described to neighbors as serving in the Navy, somewhere. A convenient afterthought in conversations centered around Brianna's latest achievement. And I told myself I did not need them to understand. I only needed to keep my footing within the world where my work mattered. But somewhere deep inside, A quiet ache had begun to form an ache built from being valued and erased at the same time. And I knew that one day the two worlds would collide in a way none of us could ignore. Back in that bright hall at the country club, the old ache sat under my ribs as I watched Brianna glide from table to table like she owned the night, her dress catching the chandelier light, while I stayed closer to the wall, reminding myself to breathe as a room full of people who knew our last name pretended they knew our story. And even before she told me to sit in the back, there had been enough small humiliations to make my throat tight. The place hummed with talk and clinking glasses, great aunts in floral dresses, uncles tugging at collars, neighbors from our old street, and my mother's church friends all arranged around white tablecloths and centerpieces Brianna had chosen. And at the center of it, my mother sat under a banner that said, 70 years loved, with a smile that looked like it might crack if anyone stared too long. When I walked in, a server handed me a folded program, and as I opened it, my eyes went straight to the printed names, host and main speaker, Brianna Locke Slideshow, by Brianna Toast from eldest daughter. Then near the bottom, a small line that read, family, including Avery. No hint that I had flown across the country between deployments. No hint that years of my life existed outside this room. Brianna brought people to me like props touching my elbow and saying, "This is my sister. She's in the Navy somewhere drawing out somewhere," as if the exact place did not matter. And a woman I half remembered from church smiled and asked, "So are you a nurse or something?" The softest box she could put me in, and I said, not exactly letting the words hang there. Before I could redirect the moment, Brianna laughed and added, "She cannot say much classified, turning the word into something you would tease a teenager with," and the two of them chuckled, as if we were sharing a light joke, rather than watching my work flattened into a line that sounded silly over cake. A cousin squeezed my arm and said, "It is good you can get away from base. Your sister has been doing everything for your mom while you have been off traveling." And while I nodded, the word traveling scraped hard against memories of nights and places, with no banners or music, just the awareness that one mistake could mean someone did not go home. When the MC tapped the microphone and called for Locke family up front for pictures, I set my glass down and moved toward the head table without thinking. Because when someone called for the team, my body was used to going forward, not staying seated and hoping no one noticed me, and for one brief second, I let myself picture standing beside my mother like any other daughter on any other milestone birthday. I was a few steps from the open space by the cake when Brianna stepped into my path, her heels clicking, her public smile fixed, as she leaned in close enough for me to feel her breath and said, "You can hang back. We are doing immediate family first," as if the years I had spent away had shifted me into some outer ring. I looked toward my mother, hoping she would frown or wave me forward, but she kept her eyes on the photographer fingers twisted together in her lap, doing what she had done my whole life, refusing to look straight at the cut, so she would not have to admit it was there. The MC called again. Locke family let us get a round of applause, his cheerful voice filling the space between us, and that was when Brianna straightened, turned slightly so that the nearest tables could hear, and said, "Sit in the back. You are not important." Each word slow and clear enough to land. For a heartbeat, my mind refused to catch up because it is one thing to feel unimportant and another to hear your own sister announce it in public. But then I saw the small spark of satisfaction in her eyes, and the tiny shrug she gave an aunt, and the noise in the room shifted. Some cousins suddenly very focused on their napkins, an uncle coughing into his fist, one of my mother's friends pressing her lips together, then letting the moment pass. Their silence wrapped around her sentence until it felt heavier than anything she could have thrown at me alone, and heat climbed the back of my neck, the kind that made my hands curl before training. Uncurled them again. It would have been easy to list off dates and places and names they would never hear on the news to tell them what somewhere actually looked like in the dark. But another part of me, The one that had learned not to waste energy on the wrong fight held my jaw shut and let the anger move through me without breaking loose. Out there, when my team lined up at the back of a truck, they waited for my nod before stepping off. They listened when I said move or hold, and men with more years in uniform than I had on this earth once followed my lead without hesitation. Yet in this room, one sentence from my sister was enough to erase all of that in the eyes of people who shared my blood. I thought about turning around and walking straight out into the parking lot, calling a ride slipping back to the quiet of base housing where no one cared how far I sat from a cake, but my gaze kept drifting to my mother under that banner, to the way her shoulders had tensed, even though she kept smiling, and some old loyalty I did not know how to switch off kept my feet planted. So I stepped aside without a word and let Brianna guide my mother to the center, watched Hank fill in the other side, saw the photographer raise the camera, while the MC made a small joke about strong daughters and strong mothers, and I backed away until the laughter blurred. At the rear of the hall, a row of extra chairs waited near the tall windows by the buffet, and I took the last one. The seat pressed against the glass, the cool pain at my shoulder helping slow my breathing as I sat down. In the faint reflection, I saw a woman in a simple dress, shoulder-straight hands tight in her lap, and if I squinted, I could almost believe she was just another guest, not the daughter who had just been told in front of an entire room that she did not matter. The MC asked everyone to give it up for the Locke family, and the applause rolled forward, and I sat in that back row listening to it wash over people who thought they understood what family meant, thinking that I had stared down men with rifles and never felt as exposed as I did now, sitting quietly in a borrowed chair, while my place in this family was rewritten, one sentence at a time. In that back row with the glass, cool against my shoulder, and the sound of applause, fading into something dull, my mind did what it always did when the sting became too sharp in the present. It dragged me back through other nights, when the same pattern played out in different clothes, years of small cuts that I had told myself to ignore because I was only home for a few days at a time and did not want to spend them fighting battles I could not win. I remembered coming home from a deployment in 2022 that had left my body buzzing with a nervous energy I could not shake. My sleep splintered into short stretches, broken by flashes of alleyways and doorways and the echo of a radio call that had gone bad, and I sat at my mother's kitchen table with a mug of coffee going cold in my hands, while my eyes tried to stay focused on the here and now, on the faded curtains, and the hum of the refrigerator, and the way the late afternoon light hit the sink. Brianna slid into the chair across from me, phone in hand, and listened for about 30 seconds as I stumbled over vague words like long and rough and tired before she tipped her head and said, "Maybe you like the drama too much." Normal people do not choose to live like that, her tone light, but her eyes sharp, as if my whole life were a spectacle. I kept signing up for instead of a duty I had taken on, so other people could stay exactly as safe and normal as she insisted they deserved to be. That night, Hank held court in the living room with a couple of his bar friends, a game on the television and cheap beer on the table, and I heard him laugh and tell them, "At least we have someone in the military that gets you discounts right," talking about me like a rewards card he could flash at the counter instead of a daughter who could barely close her eyes without seeing shapes move in the dark. And one of the men nodded and said it must be nice to have that kind of backup when business is slow. A few months later, Hank cornered me by the sink after dinner with a stack of papers in his hand, his voice pitched in the reasonable register he used when he wanted to sound like a good provider, explaining that the bar had gone through a rough patch that the bank needed to see more stability, that if we could use my veterans loan benefits to rearrange the mortgage, it would lower payments and keep everything afloat. Family helping family, nothing complicated, just a signature or two to show I had faith in them. I hesitated because even with my limited experience in civilian real estate, I knew entangling my name with his debts carried risk. But he kept talking about how my mother could not handle another move, how this neighborhood and this bar were all she knew. And then Brianna joined in, leaning against the counter, asking if family only mattered when I needed a place to crash between deployments, or if I could show up for something that did not come with a uniform on top, her words sliding in under my skin. I let my guard down, told myself I was overthinking it, that signing on to one more document was not a big deal when I was already putting my life on the line in other ways, and I scrawled my name on pages I did not fully read, trusting their summary more than the fine print, a decision that would come back to haunt me later when I understood just how thoroughly I had been pulled into their financial mess. I thought of the funeral we attended for a distant cousin the next year, a humid Texas afternoon where the air around the cemetery seemed to press down on everyone, and I had worn my dress Navy uniform because I wanted to honor the occasion properly, because there is a particular weight to the way the cloth sits on your shoulders that reminds you of the people you represent. But as soon as I stepped out of the car, I felt eyes move over the medals on my chest and then slide away, as if they did not quite know where to land. Brianna walked a step ahead of me, her heels sinking slightly into the grass, and when one of her friends from high school appeared at the edge of the crowd, she leaned in and whispered loud enough for me to hear that I really thought I was something dressing up like that for a family funeral, as if the uniform were a costume I had pulled from the back of a closet for attention, instead of something I had bled and frozen and sweated to earn. During the reception in the church hall, an uncle slapped my shoulder and asked with a laugh, "So, do you actually fight, or is it more like office work?" His eyes searching my face for an answer that would fit neatly into his idea of what women did in the service. And when I shrugged and said I did my job, he nodded, as though I had confirmed his suspicion that nothing I did could be that serious. It was always like that, small comments that piled up until they felt heavier than any helmet or pack I had carried. You are never here when we need you. You chose the Navy, not family. Brianna is the one taking care of mom lines tossed out at holiday tables and backyard barbecues, whenever I hesitated to sign something or questioned a decision, and over time they became the script everyone in the family knew by heart. I started to notice how often mail with my name on it appeared in stacks on the dining room buffet when I visited envelopes from banks and insurance companies that my mother would slide quickly into a drawer when I walked in, saying it was just junk. And one afternoon when she was in the shower, I caught a glimpse of a document with my signature at the bottom that I did not remember writing the ink slightly off the line above it, filled with language about guarantees and obligations that made my stomach twist. When I asked Brianna about it later, she waved a hand and said Hank had just recopied a form I had already signed because the original had a coffee stain. No big deal. And then she shifted the conversation to my next deployment date before I could press further, her smile fixed, while something behind her eyes stayed wary. I told myself I was tired, that the constant transitions between continents and time zones made my memory fuzzy, that I was reading too much into family paperwork, but a seed of doubt settled next to the old ache, and every time Hank or Brianna mentioned the bar or the house or the phrase "we are all in this together," that seed pushed a little deeper. By the time the night of the birthday party rolled around, those years of offhand remarks and casual uses of my name had built a quiet storm inside me, a complicated tangle of love and obligation and resentment. And as I sat in that extra chair watching my own reflection blur in the window, I realized that I had survived ambushes and roadside blasts and nights when the power cut out and every sound made my heart slam. But what I had not figured out how to survive was the feeling of being used by my own blood without even being asked, turned into a resource to be tapped rather than a person to be seen. And for the first time, I let myself admit that this was not just stress or misunderstanding. It was a pattern that had been there all along, one I could no longer afford to ignore. The night air outside the country club felt cooler than I expected, and I walked toward the back patio without telling anyone where I was going, letting the muffled music fade behind me, while the glow from the windows cast long shapes across the grass, and for a moment, I just stood there staring at the rows of parked cars, their windshields catching the last light like a line of silent watchers, and the hollow feeling inside me deepened until it felt like something had come loose and was drifting without direction. I had spent years stepping into places where the ground could shift under me without warning, where the wrong sound or the wrong shadow could mean the difference between making it home or not yet standing a few feet from my own family inside that bright hall. I felt more out of place than I ever had overseas, and the thought pressed so hard on my chest that I pushed both hands into my pockets just to feel something solid. I was turning to go back inside when I heard footsteps near the edge of the parking lot, the low murmur of voices carrying across the open space, and I paused because I recognized Brianna's laugh, that clipped sound she made when she thought she was being clever, followed by Hank's deeper voice and another man I did not know. I told myself to walk away to ignore whatever they were whispering about, but then I heard my name spoken casually, almost lazily, and something kept my feet rooted as I stepped back behind a hedge, letting the shadows pull around me the way they had on countless deployments when listening meant living. The man I did not know asked how things were going with the bar, and Hank answered that everything would be fine as long as she keeps signing, and Brianna added she is, basically, our walking credit score. Her voice smooth, amused as if she were talking about a store coupon instead of a sister standing 10 feet away. And then the man laughed and said something about military benefits being good to have in the family, especially when people overseas get hazard pay. Like that extra money meant I owed them some kind of loyalty tax. Brianna kept going, saying she thinks she is a hero, but no one here cares what she does over there. And Hank said something about me being too dramatic, always acting like the world was on my shoulders. And the man agreed, saying at least they got something out of it, meaning my signature, my benefits, my credit. All the pieces of my life they had carved up without blinking. Each sentence landed like a blunt hit to my ribs, and I stood there swallowing air that suddenly felt too thin. The weight of understanding settling in with a clarity so sharp I almost leaned forward, because for the first time it clicked that this was not just thoughtlessness or bad communication or old habits. This was a system they had built where I existed only as an asset to be used, not a daughter or a sister or even a human being they cared to understand. When they finished talking, they walked back toward the building, still laughing, and I stayed in the shadow until the door shut behind them, the sound closing off the last thread of denial I had held on to, and I knew that whatever I had been fighting to believe about this family no longer matched the truth that had just been laid bare. Later that night at my mother's house, I went into my old room, the posters long gone and the bedspread different, but the same faint smell of dust and old books lingering in the air, and I lay down fully dressed, staring at the ceiling, while the silence pressed against me so thick I could hear my own pulse. Sleep never came. Only flashes of memory, a door bursting open in a dim corridor, the snap of commands over a radio, the metallic taste of adrenaline when everything hinged on minutes, the face of a teammate bleeding, but still trying to stand, and then the image would twist into Brianna blocking me at the party, telling me to sit in the back, and my body jerked, as if bracing for impact that never arrived. Around dawn, I sat up my throat tight, and for a long time I just stared at the framed photo on the dresser from when Brianna and I were kids, her smiling wide, my arms slung around her waist, the two of us unaware of the map our lives were already tracing, and the question rose like a tide. I could not hold back. Why did I fight so hard to come back to people who would not even give me a chair at their table? I walked into the bathroom, turned on the light, and blinked at my reflection. The dark circles under my eyes deeper than usual, a faint scar at my hairline catching the glare, and when I touched the counter to steady myself, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I expected a message from the command or maybe a reminder from the airline for my return flight, but when I slid my thumb across the screen, the subject line made my stomach clench. notification of shared account activity, something about a loan adjustment needing confirmation, and when I tapped it open, the words hit even harder than the voices I had heard the night before. A new debt had been placed under my name, along with another signer, a debt I had never agreed to. For a second, the room tilted and I gripped the sink, scrolling down to the attached document, staring at a signature that looked like mine, but not quite the slant wrong. The pressure, uneven a copy of a copy. Something pulled from an older form and pasted onto a new trap, and my throat tightened with a heat that had nothing to do with embarrassment or hurt something deeper, sharper, the kind of anger that burns cold. I stepped back from the mirror and studied my face, the pale cast of exhaustion still clinging to me, the evidence of sleepless years etched in faint lines I had not noticed until this moment, and for the first time since I'd put on a uniform at 18, I whispered to myself that maybe the battlefield was not out there anymore. Maybe the one that mattered now was right here, in this house, in these people I kept trying to believe were mine. Morning light drifted through the thin curtains in my mother's kitchen, soft and almost gentle. But the moment I stepped inside and saw Hank and Brianna already seated at the table with a neat stack of papers between them, that softness vanished, replaced by the same tight pressure I had felt in the parking lot the night before, and Brianna gave me a smile that did not reach her eyes as she tapped the stack with 2 fingers and said, "We figured it all out for you, so you would not have to stress about it." I stayed by the doorway, my hand still wrapped around my phone, and Hank pushed the papers forward with a nod that suggested this was all routine. Nothing to think about, just family business, something we could handle quickly before breakfast. Brianna launched into her explanation, saying the bar had been hit with rising costs, and the mortgage adjustments were putting pressure on Mom and Hank, and if we redistributed signatures and responsibilities, it would smooth everything out. And she spoke with the same tone she used when she convinced waiters to comp her drinks, calm and entitled, and slightly impatient, while Hank added that this was only to take some weight off my mother's shoulders, since I was never around to help with anything else. I walked to the table, slowly pulled out a chair, and took the top document, scanning the first paragraph, feeling a pulse of heat start at my neck as I saw words like guarantor and transfer of obligation and primary signer my name printed neatly in places I had never seen before. And while my eyes moved line by line, I heard Brianna sigh dramatically and say, "Avery, we do not have time for your overthinking. Just sign. You are never here anyway. This is the least you can do for Mom." The last sentence hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown familiar because it had been used on me for years. But this time, something in me did not shift or shrink the way it once had. Instead, it settled deeper. Steady the way my breathing steadied before stepping into a mission brief. I placed the paper back on the table, slid the pen toward the center, and said the word that had been rising in me since the email from the bank. The word that felt heavier than anything I had spoken in this house: no. Brianna's head snapped up, her eyebrows lifting as if she had misheard, and she tilted her chin and said, "Excuse me," in the same clipped tone she had used the night she shoved me to the back row, but I did not let her gather momentum. I repeated it, firmer. Slower. "No, I will not sign anything until my lawyer reviews it, and I'm getting my name removed from whatever you used it for without asking." The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt charged, sharp, stretching from one wall to the other, and then Hank stood up so fast his chair scraped against the floor, his voice rising as he reminded me of every meal he had ever bought when I was a teenager. Every night I had slept under his roof when he and my mother got married, every supposed sacrifice he had made on my behalf, twisting the past into a chain he expected me to keep dragging forever. And then he jabbed a finger at the papers and shouted that family comes before pride, that I owed them this after all they had done. Brianna jumped in, her voice trembling with anger or fear, or both, saying, "We have carried this family while you played hero overseas. We were the ones here dealing with real life, not running around with guns, pretending to save the world." And she said it with the confidence of someone who believed her version of reality, should override everyone else's, including mine. I pushed my chair back and rose slowly, not out of intimidation, but because I wanted my movements measured, wanted each word to come out clean and steady, and I looked at both of them without flinching. While I said overseas, I always knew who the enemy was here. It took me longer, and that is my fault, but it will not happen again. I did not raise my voice. I did not match their rage. I simply picked up my phone and walked out the back door, leaving their shouts bouncing off the kitchen tiles behind me as I stepped onto the small porch, where the morning air felt cooler than the night before. I stood there long enough to steady my heartbeat, long enough to remind myself that saying no was not betrayal, that protecting myself was not abandonment. And then I opened my contacts and called a friend at the JAG office in Coronado, who answered on the second ring, his voice groggy but alerting instantly when he heard the edge in mine. And I explained quickly that I needed guidance, that something was wrong with my financial documents back home, that I needed to know what steps to take. He told me to take pictures of everything, every page, every signature, every date, and to email them immediately. So I walked back into the kitchen just long enough to gather the papers, while ignoring the accusations being thrown my way, photographed each sheet in the living room, and sent them to both JAG and a civilian lawyer I trusted in San Diego. Once the last file uploaded, I opened my messages and typed the words that felt strangely grounding. Falcon 3 here, I might need a favor on Saturday. Nothing illegal, just presence. And within minutes, my screen lit up with Chief's response copy that the team stands by you, we owe you more than a few. I closed my eyes for a second, letting that affirmation settle like armor forming around me. And then I lifted the phone again and recorded a short voice note to remind myself that lines drawn in survival do not have to be loud to be final. As I walked toward my car, the narrator part of my mind, the one that had spent years watching life unfold in patterns and aftershocks, whispered the question that I knew other people had felt too, and I let it shape itself into words that I knew would matter later, the kind meant for women who kept swallowing their hurt to keep the peace. And I said, have you ever reached that point where enough is the only word left? Because if you have, what comes next is not pretty, but it is necessary, and if this hits close to home, tell me in the comments, someone else may need to see. They are not alone. I drove to the airport with the sunrise turning the sky a dull gold, booked the earliest flight to Coronado, and leaned back in my seat as the plane lifted above the clouds, knowing that I was preparing for two battles. Now, one fought with paperwork and truth, and the other fought with the kind of exposure that cracked open every lie my family had built around me. And for the first time in a long while, I felt steady because this time I was not stepping into danger without knowing who stood on which side. The moment I stepped back into the country club that evening, slipping into the seat Brianna had banished me to the room, felt colder than before, as if something underneath the polite conversations and clinking glasses had shifted, and I sat there trying to steady my breathing while the slideshow of Brianna's curated life continued to glow against the far wall. Outside the tall windows, the sky had deepened into a navy blue that reminded me of pre-mission hours, the kind where silence feels thick enough to grip, and every few seconds headlights from arriving cars swept across the glass and briefly lit my reflection. The outline of someone who looked calm but was holding too many fractures under the surface. I clasped my hands together in my lap and tried to focus on my mother's soft laughter at the front of the room, telling myself to stay still, to wait, because part of me had predicted the humiliation, but another part of me had prepared for what came after. Then, just as I was tracing the rim of my water glass to keep my fingers from shaking, a low, synchronized rumble echoed from the parking lot, a familiar sound to anyone who had ever ridden in convoy, a sound that did not belong to a birthday party. A few guests near the windows turned their heads curious, and one of the men leaned closer to the glass before murmuring something to his wife. And I followed his gaze just long enough to see the silhouettes of several SUVs pulling into a loose formation, not flashy, not aggressive, just deliberate in a way only trained people moved. The engines shut off at the same time, and the doors opened, releasing a row of young men in civvies. their hair cropped close, their posture unmistakable, and even without uniforms, the room shifted as if some instinct told everyone that these were not casual visitors wandering into the wrong event. I recognized the way they scanned their surroundings, relaxed but aware. And even before I saw Chief's broad shoulders move to the front of the group, I knew exactly who had arrived. The timing was not accidental, it was the favor I had asked for with a tightness in my chest the day before. And now, watching them walk toward the entrance, I felt both gratitude and a rising ache that came from being seen, really seen by people who knew the weight of what I carried. Inside the hall, a server hurried in from the lobby, slightly breathless, and addressed Brianna first because she assumed the sister in the designer dress must be the one in charge, saying, "Ma'am, there are some Navy guys outside asking for an Avery lock." The room went quiet for a beat before Brianna laughed loudly enough for the nearest tables to hear, tilting her head back as she said, "Oh God, did she invite her little buddies? That is embarrassing." And a few people chuckled politely, not sure what to think while I felt my stomach coil, but kept my back straight, because I knew what was coming next. The lobby doors opened and Chief Miller stepped just inside the threshold, broad-shouldered hands behind his back, the glow from the hallway framing him in sharp outline, and for half a second, the entire room seemed to forget how to breathe. Chief's eyes swept the hall until they landed on me at the farthest table, and without waiting another moment, he planted his feet squared. His stance filled his lungs and shouted in a voice that carried across deserts and ocean wind Falcon 3 in the room. The words slammed into the air like a detonation, and before anyone could process them, he turned slightly and lifted 2 fingers in a signal. And from the parking lot, the rest of my team responded in unison, chanting the call sign in the same cadence they used during insertion drills. Falcon 3, Falcon 3, the sound reverberating through the glass, bouncing off the chandeliers, pulling every pair of eyes toward me. A wave of murmurs rippled through the hall as guests turned in their seats, whispering, "Is she, their commander, or Navy SEALs, or she looks too young," and some of them stood to see better, because the chant alone carried a kind of authority that did not need explanation. Chief strode forward with Ramirez O'Neal Jackson and 2 others, forming a loose formation behind him, their expressions serious but warm, the kind of controlled respect that came naturally to men who had seen someone make life or death calls and survive the cost. He stopped a few feet from where I sat, lifted his chin, and said clearly enough for every corner of the hall to hear, "Ma'am, we came by to thank you. We would not be standing here if it were not for you." The words dropped into the room like a stone into still water, and for a heartbeat no one moved. The meaning settling through the crowd as heads turned from Chief to me and back, as if trying to reconcile the girl pushed to the back with the leader being honored. I exhaled slowly, placed my napkin on the table, and stood the legs of the chair sliding back with a soft scrape that somehow sounded louder than the chant outside. And as I started walking up the aisle between the tables, I watched my team straighten instinctively, then part into 2 clean columns, giving me a path forward, as if we were back on base and not surrounded by linen tablecloths and birthday decorations. People whispered my name as I passed, unsure, surprised, and when I reached Brianna, she looked smaller than I remembered, her arms stiff at her sides, her face pale in a way makeup could not hide, and I paused long enough to let the weight of the moment settle before I spoke. "You told me to sit in the back because I was not important," I said, my voice calm but clear, and I watched her blink at the echo of her own cruelty. Then I continued out there. "I lead from the front, and in case you are wondering, they are not my little buddies. They are my men, and they are alive because I did my job." A silence thicker than anything earlier followed, stretching across the room until even the servers froze with trays halfway lifted, and then my mother brought her hand to her mouth as tears spilled over her lashes, her chest trembling as if she had finally understood something she had missed for too many years. An older couple near the center table began clapping softly, unsure, but moved, and the sound grew as more guests joined a scattered applause that built into something fuller, not celebration, but recognition. Brianna looked around as if searching for a place to hide, but there was nowhere left to go, not with the truth laid out so plainly, not with the entire room watching the contrast between the sister she pretended I was and the soldier I had become. By the time I drove back to my mother's house that night, the energy from the country club still clung to me, a mix of shock and release, and something like vindication humming just beneath my skin. And the moment I stepped into the quiet hallway, I could already feel my phone vibrating nonstop in my pocket, because word travels fast in families that talk more than they listen. When I finally sat on the edge of the bed and unlocked the screen, I saw message after message flooding in names I had not heard from in years, lighting up the Thread cousins who used to ask if I filed papers for the Navy, saying they were proud an aunt who once suggested I find a real career asking for forgiveness, a coworker from my mother's old job, admitting she never understood what I actually did until tonight, and reading through them felt strange, not comforting. Exactly more like watching people rearrange their memories to hide the fact that they had spent so long dismissing me. I let the messages sit unanswered as I leaned back and stared at the ceiling, letting the truth settle the truth that exposing who I was had never been my intention. But once it happened, people suddenly saw what had always been there, and the hypocrisy of it pressed hard enough that I closed my eyes to steady myself. Over the next few days, the ripple spread wider, relatives calling my mother to ask why she had never told them her daughter was in Special Operations Neighbors, who once waved politely but never cared, stopping her at the grocery store to offer congratulations, and even some of Brianna's friends reached out to me directly trying to distance themselves from her comments at the party. I did not answer those either because I knew the difference between remorse and embarrassment. The real shift came when my lawyer called less than a week later, his voice low and controlled as he explained that he had reviewed the documents I sent, and there were clear inconsistencies and several signatures attributed to me, the most serious involving a refinance attempt tied to Hank's bar. He said there were signs that my signature had been copied from an older form and applied to new paperwork without authorization, and hearing those words made my stomach twist, because even though I had suspected something was off, having proof felt like stepping into cold water. He went on to say that if the bank continued its investigation and determined that fraud was involved, the consequences could be significant for whoever submitted those documents. And while he assured me that I had strong legal grounds to remove myself from every loan connected to my name, he also warned that Hank and Brianna might face legal exposure if they did not cooperate. I sat there listening, my hand gripping the phone tighter with each sentence, and when he asked whether I wanted to escalate immediately or attempt a negotiated resolution, first, I felt the older part of me, the daughter who once apologized for existing, hesitate, but then the part of me who had learned to make decisions under pressure stepped forward. I told him I did not want to put anyone behind bars, that I was not looking to destroy lives, but I would no longer allow mine to be used as collateral. I wanted every loan with my name removed, every use of my VA benefits reversed or blocked permanently, and I wanted the bank notified that any attempt to use my military status without explicit consent was to be frozen outright. He said he would start the process immediately and that JAG had already flagged my file for additional protection. And when I hung up, I felt something inside me shift again, a tether snapping that I had not even known was still attached. Within 2 weeks, the consequences began showing up like dominoes falling. The bank halted the refinance that Hank had been counting on, citing active investigation, which meant the bar could not get the cash flow it needed, and rumors started moving through the community that the business might not survive the summer. Brianna, who always talked about expansion and future investments, suddenly went silent online, her fiancé posting vague messages about taking a break from social commitments, and a mutual acquaintance mentioned she had lost a large sum she had poured into a partnership tied to the bar, a sum she had expected to recover once the loan went through. I heard whispers that her fiancé had begun asking questions about why my credit had been involved. At all questions, she did not have good answers for, and the image she had spent years crafting began to crack in places she could not hide. Meanwhile, the people who had dismissed me for so long started acting as though they had known my worth all along, inviting me to speak at their church women's group about resilience and service, or asking if I could mentor their daughters who were thinking about joining the military. And while their sudden admiration felt shallow, it also revealed something important, that the truth did not need me to advertise it. It simply needed room to exist without being smothered by their narrative. Each time I stood in front of a small circle of older women who listened with real sincerity, I realized how much simpler life becomes when you stop shrinking yourself to fit into other people's comfort zones. But the fallout was not over. One evening, just after sunset, my phone rang and Hank's name appeared on the screen, the same name that had hovered over documents I never agreed to, and I let it ring twice before answering. His voice came through sharp and angry, stripped of the fake warmth he used when he wanted something, and he said, "You ruined us, Avery. You had to make everything difficult. You had to show off, and now the bank will not work with us. The investors have backed away. Everything is falling apart because you wanted to play soldier." I waited until he finished, until the last accusation hung in the air like smoke, and then I said, in a tone so steady it surprised even me, "I did not ruin you. I just stopped letting you ruin me." There was a long silence on the line, a silence heavy enough to crack the space between us, and before he could respond, I ended the call. My thumb pressing the screen with a finality that felt like sealing a door behind me. A few weeks passed between that night at the country club and the day Brianna finally reached out, weeks where the noise around my name slowly settled while the consequences of the truth kept rolling through her life. And when her message came asking to meet for coffee near the River Walk in San Antonio, I stared at it before typing a simple yes, not out of curiosity about her excuses, but because I wanted to look her in the eye when I gave her the answer. I knew she was coming to collect the answer she had never believed I was capable of saying. The cafe she chose was narrow with tall windows and chipped tables, and when I walked in, the smell of espresso wrapped around me, familiar and warm in a way the rest of this city no longer felt, and for a moment, I just stood there, letting my eyes adjust from the glare outside to the softer light inside, watching her, before she realized I was there. Brianna was already at a corner table, both hands clamped around a mug. She was not drinking, and the sight of her made me pause. Not from sympathy, but from the contrast between the sister who had sparkled under chandelier lights and the woman in front of me, now her hair pulled back in a rush knot makeup, barely covering the shadows under her eyes. Her blouse wrinkled like it had been grabbed off the floor, as if life had finally stopped giving her time to stage everything. She looked up quickly when she heard my footsteps, and for a second, something raw flickered across her face before she forced a small smile and said, "Thanks for coming like we were colleagues instead of sisters on opposite sides of a line," and I sat down without hugging her, set my phone face down on the table, and waited, letting the silence stretch until she had to be the one to fill it. She started with tears. They came fast as she talked about Mom and how worried she was that the stress would make her health worse about Hank's temper, and the unpaid invoices stacking up about the rumors that the bar would not make it to Christmas, and she kept pressing the word, "We like a bruise. We are drowning. We have done everything. We are the ones here," painting a picture where she was the exhausted guardian and I was the selfish outsider. Then she reached for the old script, saying, "We are family. We fight, but we stick together. That is what you learned in the military. You do not abandon your own." Her voice trembling just enough to sound sincere to anyone who did not know how often she had used that same tone to get her way. I listened without interrupting, my fingers loose around my cup, letting every guilt hook she cast glance off instead of sink in, because now I had the bank emails and the forged lines of ink in my mind like armor. I had the memory of her voice calling me a walking credit score, and I waited for the turn from heartbreak to request the moment where the mask slipped and the ask showed through. It slipped out almost casually, like she was tossing in an afterthought. She said the bank would listen to someone like me, that my record would carry weight, that if I would just talk to them, maybe co-sign a new restructuring, maybe show up in uniform once to reassure an investor they might reconsider. And she even gave a weak little laugh as she painted the picture of herself saying, "My little sister is one of those special Navy women that has to count for something like my years of training and deployments were a shiny sticker she could slap on a battered loan application." I let the words hang and then asked quietly, "When you told me to sit in the back because I was not important, did you think I was family then?" And the way her eyes widened told me she had not expected that sentence to come back at her in daylight, in a place where there were no chandeliers and no audience to clap on cue. Her mouth opened and closed, and she shook her head quickly, reaching for excuses, saying she had been stressed that the party had been a lot, that she did not mean it, that I knew she said things she did not mean under pressure, pushing the blame onto the night, onto Hank, onto anything but the intention in her voice, when she told me to move, and I watched her try to smooth over a crack that had already split the floor under both of us. I kept my eyes on hers until she shifted in her chair, and then I spoke not loud but clear, telling her I would always help Mom directly, that if Mom needed a doctor or a safer place to live, I would step in with my own money and time, that my promise was to the woman who had done her best to raise me in the middle of her own mess, not to the debts other people created. But I would not allow my uniform, my signature, or my service to be used as a patch over their bad decisions again. Not after seeing exactly how they talked about me when they thought I was not listening. I reminded her they had already used my silence to paint me as unreliable, while cashing in on the benefits attached to my name, that they had already taken my trust and turned it into leverage at the bank, and then I said it slowly, so there was no room to twist it. You used my silence, my signature, and my uniform. You do not get to use my name anymore, not with the bank, not with investors, not with anyone. And the way her jaw clenched told me she understood that a door had just closed and was not going to open again. Her face tightened, and she leaned in with a harder edge, accusing me of choosing strangers over my own blood, asking how I could stand by men I had known a few years and turn my back on the people who had been there since childhood, as if time alone erased everything they had done. And I felt something inside me go very still, the same stillness I felt before stepping into a dark building, and I answered that out there, those so-called strangers would die for me, and I would do the same for them at home. My own blood signed me away for a loan. I have made my choice, and I am not changing it, and saying it out loud felt less like an attack and more like finally stating a simple, brutal fact. The words landed between us like a locked hatch, leaving nothing for her to pry open, and for the first time in my life, I watched Brianna run out of lines. She stared for a few seconds, then shoved her chair back so hard it scraped, grabbed her bag and stood saying, "Fine, when everything falls apart. Do not come running to us." And she walked out of the cafe with her chin high but her shoulders tight. The posture of someone who had run out of weapons and now only had pride to cling to. And when the door closed behind her, I sat there listening to the low murmur of other conversations, feeling not triumph, but a clean ache, the ache of finally stopping a fight that had only ever gone one way. Outside, the afternoon sun was bright on the river, and I stepped into it. Pulled out my phone and called my mother, my voice softening when she answered. I told her she did not have to stay welded to the wreck of the bar, that if she ever wanted to move, there were small places we could find, quieter neighborhoods or somewhere near the coast where she could breathe easier, that I would help pay the rent and visit when I could, that my promise was to her, not to Hank's mistakes. And there was a pause long enough that I heard her breathing steady itself before she finally spoke, and her voice shook as she said she was sorry for all the times she had stayed quiet when I was pushed aside. Sorry for letting Brianna and Hank decide who I was while she looked away. Sorry it had taken her this long to say anything at all. I closed my eyes against the glare off the water and let those words sink in, not as an instant cure for years of damage, but as a small clearing at the edge of the battlefield where something gentler might one day grow, and for the first time in a long time, I hung up feeling that moving forward did not have to mean carrying everyone with me, only the ones who were finally willing to stop using me as a shield. A few months later, the sharp edges of everything that had happened began to soften. Not because time erased any of it, but because distance let me breathe in a way I had not realized I needed, and Coronado wrapped itself around me with its familiar rhythm, the sound of waves folding against the shore, the hum of aircraft in the distance, the low murmur of teammates greeting each other during early morning drills, and slowly the chaos that had lived in my chest began to settle into something quieter, steadier. I spent most evenings running along the beach, letting the sand pull at my shoes, while the sky shifted through gold and pink, and every so often I passed a group from my unit heading back from training, who would straighten instinctively and call out, "Evening, ma'am," or "Good run, Falcon 3," and each acknowledgement hit me differently now, not as a reminder of what I had to prove, but as confirmation of who I already was. One Saturday, I walked into a small community center near the base where a meeting of women veterans was already underway, a circle of chairs filled with faces that carried memories I recognized even before anyone spoke. And when the group leader asked if anyone wanted to share, I felt a quiet nudge inside me, the same kind that had pushed me through doors I once feared. I told my story without naming anyone, speaking only about being underestimated, being treated like a convenience, being told I was not important inside the place I had once called home. And as I explained how long it had taken me to say the word no, the room stayed still, some women nodding, others wiping at their eyes, not because my story was unique, but because it echoed pieces of theirs. When I finished, a woman in her 60s leaned forward and said, "Facing your own people is tougher than facing any enemy out there." And another murmured, "You did right by yourself, honey." And their voices felt like hands steadying my shoulders. Later that week, I was heading back to my car near the pier when Chief Miller caught up to me jogging the last few steps before falling into stride beside me, and he said, "You did the hardest thing, Falcon 3. I have been in places where I thought we would not make it out, but none of those came close to the look you had walking into that kitchen." And I laughed quietly because hearing it spoken out loud made something unclench in my chest. He nudged my arm lightly and added, "We stand behind you because you earned it, not because you needed us to show anything to anyone." And I nodded because I finally believed that. My relationship with my mother shifted into something softer, more honest as she took small steps toward rebuilding a life that did not revolve around managing Hank's moods or carrying Brianna's ambitions on her back, and I helped her find a small apartment near a quiet park where the rent was manageable, and the neighbors kind bringing over groceries when I visited and leaving little notes on her fridge, so she had something warm to read on harder days. She apologized every now and then for the years she stayed silent, and each time I told her the same thing, that healing did not require perfection, only direction, and seeing her choose herself was something I had waited a long time to witness. As for Brianna, I kept a safe distance, not cutting her out entirely, but refusing to step back into the maze of her expectations, responding when necessary, but never offering the pieces of myself she once took so freely. And over time, I heard through relatives that she had been forced to learn a new version of life, one where she could not lean on my name to open doors or fix numbers on a page, one where her choices finally reached their natural end without a convenient scapegoat. There was a kind of poetic justice in that, not loud or dramatic, but steady, the kind that comes when truth is allowed to stand on its own. And every time someone hinted that she missed the power she once had, I felt the slightest ache of empathy tempered by the knowledge that boundaries were the only reason I could breathe clearly now. The world around me seemed to expand as the world I had grown up in contracted, and I realized with an almost startling clarity that I no longer felt the old pull to prove anything to the people who had pushed me aside, that my worth had never lived in the seat they offered me or the table they kept me away from, that it lived in the choices I made, in the people I protected, in the way I held myself upright even when no one else was looking. I stopped replaying the words, "sit in the back," as if they had power over me, and started replacing them with the memory of my team parting into 2 rows as I walked forward, the echo of my call sign rising behind me like a tide, reminding me that importance is not granted, it is carried. One evening, I sat on the wooden bench outside my small rental near the beach, the salt air drifting across my face, while the sun lowered itself toward the horizon in a soft blaze of orange, and I opened the notebook I had started keeping, scribbling down fragments of missions, moments with teammates, small memories I did not want to lose, letting the pen move without judgment, almost like writing a private memoir the way older women in my unit once had. The pages filled slowly with stories I had never told out loud, not because I wanted recognition, but because I wanted to remember who I had been and who I was becoming. As the sky dimmed and the water reflected the last streak of light, I thought about the women who would hear this story next, the ones watching from living rooms and kitchens, the ones who had been pushed into corners of their own lives, and the words rose naturally shaped by the path I had walked. If someone has ever pushed you to the back of your own life, I hope you remember this. You are not important. You might just be sitting at the wrong table. And if this story touched a nerve, tell me in the comments. Your words might be the sign another woman needs tonight to finally say enough. The first stars appeared overhead as I closed the notebook, and in the quiet that followed, I whispered the sentence that had been forming in the back of my mind for weeks. Out there, they shout my call sign in here. I finally learned to call my own name first. And in that moment, I knew the stage had been set for the return I had expected. All along, the moment when Brianna, stripped of the image she hid behind, would come knocking with apologies, shaped like demands and regret, shaped like desperation. And for the first time in my life, I felt ready for it. Not with anger, but with clarity.